Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Grand Canyon Egyptian Cave and the men who found it. Picture a bearded man in dusty khaki standing at the mouth of a tunnel carved deep into a red canyon wall, lifting a lantern and watching the light fall on rows of hieroglyphs and a stone idol seated in a niche. That scene was printed as fact. On April 5th, 1909, a Phoenix newspaper called the Arizona Gazette ran a story headlined, "Explorations in Grand Canyon." It named the explorer as G.E. Kincaid, said he was funded by the Smithsonian Institution, and said he worked under a Professor S.A. Jordan. Together, the article claimed they had found something that should not exist. The description was enormous. A tunnel nearly a mile long, hundreds of rooms opening off cross galleries cut into solid rock, a great central chamber holding a seated idol that the article compared to a Buddha, copper weapons that had somehow kept their edge, mummies wrapped in a dark resin, and across the walls, hieroglyphs, with the whole complex described as Egyptian and Oriental in character. The location was given precisely enough to sound real, and vaguely enough to never be checked. 42 miles up the Colorado River from a marked point, high on the wall above the Little Colorado. Here is the problem. No such cave has ever been found. The interior of the Grand Canyon has been surveyed, climbed, and mapped for more than a century, and nothing matching that citadel exists. When researchers asked the Smithsonian, the answer was flat. There is no record of a G.E. Kincaid, no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan, no record of the expedition, and no artifacts. Believers reach for the canyon's own map to argue back. Features in that stretch carry names like Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, and the Tower of Ra. Egyptian names on Egyptian-sounding rock. But those names were handed out by 19th century geologists who thought the buttes looked like temples. It was Victorian Romanticism, not evidence, and the same naming habit was used on rock formations all over the world. So the discovery vanishes, and so do its discoverers. Two named men appear in a single article, describe the find of the century, and then disappear from history so completely that we cannot prove either of them was ever born. In 1992, the writer David Hatcher Childress reprinted the old text, and the legend surged into the modern era. Egyptologists keep pointing out the obvious. No genuine Egyptian material has ever been excavated anywhere in North America, and the described find is internally incoherent. An Egyptian idol compared to a Buddha, hieroglyphs beside Tibetan touches, a jumble no single ancient culture would ever produce. Some believers try to graft the story onto Hopi traditions of an ancestral underworld, but no tribal record describes an Egyptian vault in the canyon walls. Think about what that really means. A story can hand you a discovery and its finders, and then take both away so cleanly that the mystery is no longer where the cave is. The mystery is whether the men who found it existed at all. There are three honest ways to read it. It was a deliberate newspaper hoax by a small paper hungry for readers. It was a garbled retelling of an ordinary ancient site turned exotic. Or it was a real discovery, quietly buried, its investigators erased. Some vanishings at least leave a body and a name. This one left neither. Number 2. Aaron Ember and the Manuscript in the Fire. A study fills with orange light. The books along the walls are already burning, and a man in a 1920s suit turns back toward the desk, reaching for a thick leather manuscript as the smoke rolls down from the ceiling. He had made it out once. He went back in. Aaron Ember, born 1878, was an American Egyptologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. His specialty was the deep and difficult links between the ancient Egyptian language and the Semitic languages, the family that includes Hebrew and Arabic. Among philologists, the people who study the bones of languages, Ember had a real reputation. He traced shared grammar and shared roots across what we now call the Afro-Asiatic family, and he moved in the same world as the Egyptology circle of the 1920s, the world that included the men working on Tutankhamun. On the night of May 30th into May 31st, 1926, a fire broke out at his Baltimore home. By the accounts that survive, Ember escaped, and then went back for his nearly finished book on Egyptian and Semitic linguistics. The household was caught in the flames. There were deaths that night, and Ember was one of them, and the manuscript burned with him. Because he had ties to the Egyptology world, his death was quietly folded into the growing curse of Tutankhamun lists, the roll of names that newspapers had been building since Lord Carnarvon died in 1923. But the linkage is a story about a story. Ember died in a house fire, not in a tomb, and nothing about that night connects to Egypt except the field he loved. This was the 1920s. Homes were timber, lighting was gas, and fire response was thin. People died in fires that needed no curse to explain them. Later, when statisticians actually studied the so-called curse, they found no real excess of deaths among the people who had been near the tomb. What makes this one ache is the shape of the loss. The discovery here was not an object in the ground. It was knowledge, a decade of a mind's work on how two great language families were joined, and it existed in one place, on one desk, in one burning house. His ideas still fed into later Afro-Asiatic linguistics, but the book itself was gone. A single fire erased more of a scholar's work in a few minutes than any tomb robber ever managed. There are three ways to hold it. A tragic domestic accident, ordinary for its time, a coincidental name on a curse list built by editors, or a kind of martyr, a man who chose his life's work over his own life and lost both. The next scholar we meet lost his knowledge too, but not to fire. He lost it to a fishbone. Number 3. Frank Hamilton Cushing, the man who became Zuni. A pale young man sits at a fire outside an adobe pueblo, dressed in beaded sash and feathers and turquoise, initiated into a society most outsiders would never even hear named. Frank Hamilton Cushing, born 1857, worked for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology. In 1879, he joined an expedition to the Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, and instead of observing from a polite distance, he moved in. He stayed for about 4.5 years. He learned the Zuni language. He wore Zuni dress. He was initiated into the Bo priesthood, a warrior society, and took a Zuni name and rank. This was not the method of his time, and it made him famous and suspect at once. His writings, including My Adventures in Zuni and Zuni Bread Stuff, became foundational works of ethnography, the first close accounts of a living Pueblo world written from the inside. But immersion had a price. When Cushing defended Zuni land against Anglo interests trying to seize it, he made powerful enemies, and in 1884 he was recalled amid controversy. He kept working. He led the Hemingway expedition from 1886 to 1889, excavating the ancient Hohokam settlement of Los Muertos in Arizona. His health, poor since childhood, never really recovered. And then, on April 10th, 1900, at the age of 42, Frank Hamilton Cushing died suddenly. The reported cause was that he choked on a fishbone during a meal. Sit with how strange that is. A man who had crossed all the way into another culture, who had been trusted with rituals and knowledge that almost no outsider had ever received, felled at his own table by a bone in his throat. And most of what he learned in the Zuni secret societies was never written down. It could not be, or he chose not to, and it died with him in an afternoon. To this day, people debate whether recording sacred knowledge was itself a betrayal, and whether the material he did preserve should ever have left the Pueblo. His critics called him a self-mythologizer, who had gone native and lost his objectivity. His defenders point out that he essentially invented immersive fieldwork decades before anthropology made it standard. Both can be true. Here's the hard part underneath it. The more completely a scholar learns a culture, the more of that culture can die in one throat, on one ordinary day. There are 3 ways to read his end. Simple bad luck. a body worn out by years in the field, or the romantic idea that the secrets went with him on purpose. The next man's knowledge did not end at a table. It ended at the muzzle of a gun. Number 4. Richard Wetherill and the Death in Chaco Canyon. It is December 18th, 1888, and two cowboys riding after stray cattle rein up at the edge of a snowed canyon on Mesa Verde. Across the gap, tucked under a great sandstone overhang, are the stone towers of a city nobody living had described. Richard Wetherill, born 1858, was a Quaker rancher and self-taught archaeologist, and that day he and his brother-in-law Charlie Mason became the first outsiders to record Cliff Palace. Cliff Palace is the largest cliff dwelling in North America. It holds roughly 150 rooms and about 23 kivas, built into the alcove by ancestral Puebloans in the 1200s. The Wetherills dug through it and through other sites, and sold the collections they pulled out. Richard also popularized the word Anasazi, a Navajo term, as the name for these ancient people. Today, many prefer ancestral Puebloans, at the request of the modern tribes who descend from them. From Mesa Verde, he moved on to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and to Pueblo Bonito, a great house of hundreds of rooms. That work was funded through the Hyde Exploring Expedition and tied to the American Museum of Natural History. But Wetherill also filed a homestead claim over the Chaco area and ran a trading post there, and that enraged both the federal government and the local Navajo. Professional archaeologists, among them Edgar Lee Hewitt, branded him a pot hunter and a looter. The uproar over men like him helped push through the Antiquities Act of 1906, the first federal law protecting ruins. The government eventually shut down his digging and disputed his land. On June 22, 1910, Richard Wetherill was shot and killed in Chaco Canyon. The man who fired was a Navajo named Chischilling Begay, and the confrontation that led to it is genuinely disputed. Some accounts describe a quarrel over a debt or cattle. Others point to years of resentment over how Wetherill treated the Navajo, and over a white rancher claiming the ground around their ancestors' ruins. The shooter served time in prison, but the conflicting testimony meant the reason a famous man died in that canyon was never truly established. He was buried near Pueblo Bonito, in the shadow of the ruin he had spent his life pulling apart. Beyond Cliff Palace and Pueblo Bonito, Wetherill had also identified the earlier basketmaker people, pushing the human story of the Southwest back further than anyone had realized. To his critics, he was a looter whose violent end grew straight out of the anger his digging created. To his admirers, he was a gifted discoverer, betrayed by circumstance. What is undeniable is the geometry of it. The Grand Cliff cities he dragged into daylight were also the fault line of the conflict that killed him. Discovery and death in the same canyon. 3 theories stand. A frontier dispute that turned deadly. Retribution rooted in the loss of Navajo land. Or the old story that disturbing the ancient dead carries a cost. The next man refused to say where his discovery even was, and took the answer to his grave. Number 5. Theodore Morde and the Lost City of the Monkey God. Deep in the Honduran rainforest, an explorer in a pith helmet pushes aside a curtain of vines and finds himself staring at a moss-eaten stone idol shaped like a monkey. Theodore Morde, born 1911, was an American journalist and adventurer from Massachusetts, and in 1940 he led an expedition into the Musquitia jungle for the Museum of the American Indian in New York. He came home with a claim that made headlines. He had found the lost city of the monkey god, the legendary White City, Ciudad Blanca. He said he had brought back thousands of artifacts. He described a ruined city where the people had once worshipped a giant monkey god. And then he did the thing that turned a discovery into a permanent mystery. He refused to reveal where it was. He said he feared looters. He never published the coordinates, never led anyone back, and kept the location to himself. Skeptics looked at the artifacts he did show and found them ordinary, and quietly wondered whether the monkey god temple had ever existed outside his storytelling. Archaeologists have grown wary of the whole lost white city idea, with its colonial overtones, the fantasy of a vanished pale civilization, waiting in the jungle for an outsider to find it. The real settlements later mapped in Meskhetiya were given a plainer name, the City of the Jaguar, and were built by an ordinary and ordinarily impressive indigenous people. Morde went on to serve in the Second World War and to work as a reporter, his life tangled at the edges with wartime intelligence. Then, on June 26, 1954, Theodore Morde was found dead, hanged at a family home in Massachusetts. It was ruled a suicide, and because he died without ever telling anyone where the city was, the location vanished with him. For decades, that was the whole story. A lost city that may never have been real. But here the ground shifts under the skeptics. Between 2012 and 2015, laser surveys from aircraft, a technology called LiDAR, that strips away the forest canopy and maps the shapes beneath, found genuine large settlements in Meskhetiya. Researchers including Christopher Fisher documented them, and the writer Douglas Preston told the story in a 2017 book. The jungle Morde had been mocked for imagining, turned out to be hiding real forgotten cities after all. What Leader did not find was a monkey god temple, and there is no way to know whether Morde's Valley was one of these, or whether he had truly found anything at all. The modern expeditions carried their own echo of the old curse, and this one was medical. Members came down with leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease that eats at the flesh. Here's the stakes of it, stated plainly. A person can carry a real place in his head, walk out of the jungle certain of what he saw, and hang himself years before the world is willing to believe him. 3 readings survive. He found something real and took its location to the grave. He exaggerated or invented it, or LiDAR has vindicated the region even if it can never vindicate the man. The next discoverer chased cities that keep dissolving back into the clouds. Number 6. Jean Savoy and the Cities in the Clouds. On a high Andean ridge in northern Peru, circular stone ruins sit half drowned in drifting white cloud, appearing and vanishing as the mist moves. Jean Savoy, born 1927, was an American explorer who spent decades in Peru chasing exactly these places. He is credited with documenting Gran Valaya, a sprawling complex of stone structures, and Gran Pahatén in the remote Rio Abaseo region, its round buildings decorated with mosaics of stone figures. He also pushed claims about Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Inca, arguing over which site was the true one, and putting himself in direct competition with the legacy of Hiram Bingham. Savoy promoted his finds hard in books with titles like Anti-Suyo, and that showmanship split opinion. Archaeologists gave him credit for genuine reconnaissance into country almost no one else would enter, while criticizing his flair and his loose methods. The people he was chasing were real. The Chachapoya, the warriors of the clouds, built cliff sarcophagi called Purinmachus, upright clay figures set high on ledges to guard the dead, and the vast fortress of Cuelap, a walled citadel on a ridge with outer walls rising some 20 meters, older than Machu Picchu, before the Inca conquered them. And the work of reaching their ruins was genuinely deadly. Disease, brutal terrain, and isolation caused real hardship, and some expeditions saw deaths among their members and porters. In later life, Savoy turned to religion, founding a church, claiming mystical experiences, and pursuing fringe theories about ancient sailors crossing the oceans. When he died in 2007, it was of natural causes. So, the mystery around him is not his own end. It is the deaths and the secrecy that shadowed his expeditions, and the hard question of what he actually discovered. Many of the sites he publicized were already known to the local people who lived among them, and the fight over who really found them has never resolved. And the cloud forest does something eerie. It re-swallows what is found. Ruins, Savoy, documented have been overgrown and re-lost, and today Rio Abiseo National Park restricts access to Grand Pahatén to protect it, so almost no one is allowed to see it. Critics say he inflated the novelty of his finds. Defenders say he dragged global attention to a region the world had ignored. Underneath it all runs a colder fact. The Chachapoya themselves vanished, cut down by conquest and disease, so the theme doubles. He spent a life pulling cities out of the fog, and the fog is already taking them back, because some things refuse to stay found. 3 readings hold: a genuine discoverer, a self-mythologizer riding on local knowledge, or a mystic whose expeditions carried real death. The next man walked into wilderness like this and never walked out. Number 7. Everett Ruess and the Word Carved in the Canyon. 2 burros stand penned in a narrow red rock canyon in southern Utah, gear stacked nearby, their owner gone. On a sandstone wall close by, freshly cut into the rock, is a single word: Nemo. Everett Ruess, born 1914, was a young American artist, poet, and wanderer who from about 1930 traveled the Southwest alone, on foot and with pack animals, making block prints and writing long letters home. He was drawn again and again to the cliff dwellings and rock art of the ancestral Puebloans, camping among the ruins, sketching them, living close to the ancient dead. He knew artists. He crossed paths with Dorothea Lange, Ansel Adams, and the painter Maynard Dixon. And he signed his camps with a pseudonym, Nemo, Latin for no one, a name borrowed from Jules Verne and from Homer. In November 1934, at the age of 20, Ruess walked into the rugged canyon country near Escalante, into an area called Davis Gulch. He was last seen around the 11th or 12th of November. Then the letters simply stopped. When searchers came, they found his 2 burros penned in the gulch and his camp gear, but no body and no clear trail out. And they found the word Nemo carved at an ancestral Puebloan structure, dated 1934. His signature left among the ruins he loved. The theories multiplied. A fatal fall while climbing in the slot canyons. Drowning in the Colorado River. Murder by cattle rustlers who did not want a witness. Or a young man who had chosen to disappear on purpose, to vanish into a life off the map. The case has one more twist that shows how stubborn it is. In 2009, human remains found on Combe Ridge were provisionally matched to Ruess by early DNA work, alongside a Navajo account of a young white man killed by raiders. It looked, briefly, like an answer. Then in 2010, a more rigorous forensic and DNA reanalysis at the University of Colorado overturned it. The remains were Native American. They were not Everett Ruess. And so the case fell open again, and it remains open now. His block prints and his poems and his published letters, collected as a vagabond for beauty, turned him into a cult figure of desert wandering, a young artist who seemed to write his own disappearance in advance. The romantic reading is that a boy who loved the ancient ruins so much simply became part of the landscape. The skeptical reading is that a solo traveler died in lethal terrain, and his body was lost in the maze. Here is the weight of it. The same canyons he wandered, for their beauty, can erase a person so cleanly that 90 years and modern DNA still cannot find him. 3 theories endure: accident, murder, or a vanishing he chose. The next man went down into the water on purpose to pull the dead back up. Number 8. Edward Herbert Thompson and the Sacred Cenote. A man in a heavy copper diving helmet is lowered on a line into the green water of a vast natural well, sinking into a murk where the Maya once threw their offerings, and they're dead. Edward Herbert Thompson, born 1857, was an American diplomat and archaeologist who got himself appointed United States Consul to Yucatan in the 1880s, in part so he could dig. Then he did something remarkable. He bought the hacienda that contained the ruins of Chichen Itza, the great Maya city, and so gained private control of the site. His obsession was the sacred cenote, a natural limestone sinkhole about 60 meters across, its sheer walls dropping to deep green water. A 16th century bishop, Diego de Landa, had written that the Maya cast people and treasure into that well as sacrifices, and Thompson decided to find out if it was true. Around 1904 to 1910, he attacked the cenote with a dredge, and then learned to dive it himself, descending into water so cloudy he worked almost blind. What came up proved the old account. Gold and copper bells and discs, jade, balls of copal incense, wood, fragments of textile, rubber, and human bones. The physical evidence of sacrifice, hauled out of the dark after centuries. Much of it was shipped to the Peabody Museum at Harvard, which had backed his work, and that shipment became a scandal. The Mexican government sued over the removal of its antiquities, and Thompson was branded a looter and a thief. Then, around 1921, the story turned on him. His hacienda house at Chichen Itza burned to the ground amid the unrest of the Revolutionary years. Legend called it a curse, punishment for robbing the sacred well. The plainer reading is politics and law closing in on a foreigner who had carried off a nation's treasures. Both endings put him in ruin. The well gave him gold and skeletons, and then his own home went up in flames. His name was blackened, and he left the country. Decades later, some of those artifacts were returned to Mexico, and a scientific redredging by a National Geographic team in the early 1960s pulled thousands more objects from the same water, confirming everything. Weigh what it cost him. He proved that an ancient horror was real by hauling its victims into the light, and it took his home, his reputation, and his place in Mexico. 3 ways to see him: a pioneering underwater archaeologist, a colonial looter met at last by Mexican law, or a man cursed for desecrating a sacred well. The next man never lifted a shovel. He built the entire field, and Egypt still seemed to reach out for him. Number 9. James Henry Breasted, the father of American Egyptology. A scholar in wire spectacles bends toward a golden pharaoh's mask by lamplight in the doorway of a tomb, hieroglyphs glowing on the walls behind him. James Henry Breasted, born 1865, was the first American ever to earn a doctorate in Egyptology, taking it in Berlin in 1894. He became a professor at the University of Chicago, and in 1919 he founded the Oriental Institute, which grew into one of the world's great centers for the study of the ancient Near East. He gave us the phrase Fertile Crescent for the arc of early civilization from Egypt through Mesopotamia. He wrote monuments of scholarship, the multi-volume Ancient Records of Egypt, and a History of Egypt that shaped the field for generations. He translated and studied the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text, publishing his analysis in 1930, and it revealed Egyptian physicians describing injuries and treatments with a cool, clinical eye thousands of years ago. To keep recording Egypt's temples before they eroded, he set up an epigraphic survey at Chicago House in Luxor, copying inscriptions that are still being lost today. And he was tied to the Tutankhamun Circle, corresponding with Howard Carter and helping study the seal impressions after the tomb was opened in 1922. That connection placed him, in the public imagination, among the figures shadowed by the so-called curse of the pharaohs. In 1935, returning from a journey that had included Egypt, Breasted fell ill. The reported cause was a streptococcal infection, with malaria named in some accounts. On December 2nd, 1935, he died in New York, only a short time after coming home. This was before clinical penicillin. A strep infection that a few pills would beat today could kill a strongman then, and it did. But because his death followed his last Egyptian trip, the press swept him onto the curse lists beside Lord Carnarvon. The truth is quieter, and, in its way, sadder. When researchers later studied the curse seriously, including an analysis published in 2002, they found no measurable effect on the people exposed to the tomb. His son wrote a biography, Pioneer to the Past, and his real monuments still stand, the Oriental Institute and its epigraphic survey in Luxor. The discovery he leaves behind is not an object at all. It is a whole discipline, American Egyptology itself, and its founder was taken by an ordinary germ in the last years before the cure for it existed. That is the fragility hiding under the legend. 3 readings remain: an ordinary fatal infection of the pre-antibiotic age, a coincidental name on a curse list, or the symbol of a founder taken by the very land he had devoted his life to. The last vanishing is the most complete of all, a man who swam out into the sea and was never seen again. Number 10. Michael Rockefeller, lost off the Asmat coast. A catamaran floats overturned at the mouth of a wide tropical river under a heavy gray sky, and a young man in glasses, clinging to the hull, decides he is going to swim for the distant shore. Michael Clark Rockefeller, born 1938, was the son of Nelson Rockefeller, then governor of New York and later vice president of the United States. A recent Harvard graduate, Michael worked for the Museum of Primitive Art and joined the Harvard Peabody expedition to Netherlands, New Guinea, in what is now the Indonesian province of Papua in 1961. He was there to collect the art of the Asmat people, especially the towering carved ancestor poles called bish poles, some of the most striking wooden sculpture in the world. But the Asmat had a history of headhunting and ritual cannibalism, and one village in particular, Otjanep, carried a live grievance. In 1958, a Dutch colonial patrol had killed several of its men, and in Asmat belief, a death like that demanded an answering death to restore balance. On November 18, 1961, Michael and a Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing were crossing open water in a catamaran, 2 dugout canoes lashed together under a platform, when the craft was swamped and overturned near the mouth of the Betshi River. The 2 men clung to the hull through the night, drifting out to sea. In the morning, Michael judged the shore close enough to reach. He tied 2 empty gasoline cans to himself for flotation, said he thought he could make it, and started to swim. Wassing was rescued the next day. Michael Rockefeller was never seen again. A massive search by Dutch authorities and by the Rockefeller family across sea and air and land found nothing. The official conclusion was drowning or death in water thick with sharks and saltwater crocodiles. But another explanation has never gone away: that Michael reached the shore and was killed there by men of Otjanep in the revenge the old killing demanded. The official story is a drowning. The villagers, for decades, told a different story. The journalist Carl Hoffman pursued that thesis in a 2014 book called Savage Harvest, gathering Asmat accounts and colonial records that pointed to a killing on the beach. Earlier missionaries had heard the same rumors. No remains were ever found, and nothing was ever confirmed. His collection of Asmat art became the heart of the Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the objects he gathered are on display, while the man who gathered them is gone. Hold the whole picture. A young heir dove into shark water to reach the very people whose art he was carrying home, and the sea, or the shore, closed over him completely. 3 readings survive: drowning or an animal in treacherous water, a killing on the beach in cyclical revenge, or the honest unknown, the family's line against the evidence of the villages. 10 people, 10 discoveries, and 1 shared vanishing point. Line them up, and a shape appears. From a snowy sighting in 1888 to a disappearance at sea in 1961, across the American Southwest, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Egypt, and New Guinea. These 10 stories keep bending the same way. In each of them, a discovery crosses a line into sacred ground, or secret knowledge, or contested land, and loss follows close behind. The vanishings come in 3 kinds: physical disappearance, where the person simply never returns, as with Everett Ruess and Michael Rockefeller. Sudden or violent death, as with Richard Wetherill, Frank Cushing, Theodore Morde, and Aaron Ember. And erasure from the record itself, as with Kincaid and Jordan, who may never have existed to disappear. The cursed story keeps trying to attach itself to Ember, to Thompson, to Breasted. It is the mind's way of making a pattern out of coincidence, of turning bad luck into meaning. But the numbers dissolve it. When the tomb exposed were actually counted, there was no excessive death, no invisible hand. What did the killing needs? No magic. Disease in a cloud forest, drowning at a river mouth, a gunshot in a canyon, a fire in a wooden house, lethal terrain that swallows a solo traveler whole. Underneath most of these deaths runs the same fault line. These were people digging into other people's dead and other people's land. Wetherill and Thompson are almost mirror images, both accused of looting, both meeting ruin at the very sites they opened. Cushing and Rockefeller mirror each other too, both men who crossed all the way into another culture, except that one of them never came back out. And two modern tools are quietly rewriting the endings. LiDAR pulling Morde's lost cities out of the canopy. DNA testing dragging Everett Ruess's case back from a false solution. Notice how much simply dies with a person. Cushing's rights, Ember's grammar, Morde's coordinates. Knowledge that lived in one head and left the world when that head did. And notice the institutions standing behind the stories. The Smithsonian, the Peabody, the Metropolitan, quietly shaping which discoveries survive and whose names stay attached to them. The danger in all of this was never a curse. It was the ordinary, mortal cost of standing at the edge of what was known. And the cases that haunt us most are the ones with no body at all, because a grave at least gives you somewhere to stand. So the honest questions are the ones left open. Did Kincaid and Jordan ever exist? Or did a struggling newspaper invent two men in a city in a single afternoon? If there was a real cave behind the Grand Canyon story, which ordinary ruin was dressed up as an Egyptian vault, would Theodore Morde's Monkey God Valley have matched the cities that LiDAR found? Or was there never a temple to begin with? Where is Everett Ruess? In a canyon, in the river, or in a life he chose somewhere off every map? Was Michael Rockefeller taken by the sea or by the shore, and will any remains ever settle it? What did Frank Cushing learn inside the Bow priesthood that he carried out of the world unwritten? What was in Aaron Ember's manuscript that the fire took for good? How much of Jean Savoy's discovery was really the rediscovery of what local people had always known? How many Cenote artifacts still sit in the wrong country? And why the curse story keeps reattaching itself to a man who died of an ordinary infection? And there are the sites themselves, still closed, still eroding, still unexcavated, holding answers that are physically out of reach. The bodies never found. The records never kept. The permanent gaps. The honest position is that some of these will never be solved, and that is not a failure of the telling. It is the point. Every one of these people walked to the edge of what was known, and the edge is exactly where people disappear. The deep past does not give up its discoverers any more easily than it gives up its secrets. If the deep past still has questions for you, there's another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.